All right, everyone. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the interest in what we did. The work that I'm going to present today is really the work of a master's student that has since left me for the real world, Arndam Day. This is actually sort of phase 2 of some work on a research project that was funded by the ACI CRC. Dr. Jung Hu of University of Nebraska-Lincoln was our lead, and his graduate student, Miraz Mamrov. I should put a PhD after that because he completed his PhD as part of this project. I don't know how many of you might have been in the session 1 this morning, but some of the work that I'm going to present in my presentation was actually presented in the early one, so I direct you for questions on some of this stuff to Dr. Hu's presentation down the road. Essentially, I think I hit most of this. Going back real quick, our work was essentially to try to give more rapid characterization to recycled concrete aggregates. One of our biggest challenges to actually folks using this is that they're nervous about it. They're not quite sure what it contains, how much mortar content is in it, what type of contamination might be in it. And in all actuality, this is just one piece of a series of tests that we developed, and we were targeting sort of some rapid technologies and cheap, repeatable technologies to make sure that we could have some folks that get a pile of RCA either from a single source or from multiple sources from C&D waste, and understand, number one, what is your chemical composition of that in terms of potential contaminants, other components that might be in there, and also probably more importantly for confidence is that residual mortar content. How much residual mortar content is in there? I've got some recycled aggregate here on the front cover. You can kind of see it's a composite material. It's the base aggregates that were in there as well as a mortar fraction. So I'm going to talk a lot about residual mortar content as part of my presentation here. I would like to say thank you to the Committee 555 for their confidence in us to get this done, as well as we had an advisory team of accomplished folks, Kartik Obla from National Ready Mix Concrete Association, Cecil Jones, longtime NCDOT, now diversified engineering consultants, Matt Adams from NJIT, and Mark Snyder, longtime RCA advocate as well. And if you're interested, a lot of this is now available on our final report, and I'll give you some references in a minute. But essentially, for folks not familiar with a portable handheld XRF, if you really want to understand the chemical composition of something, you're looking at some tactics that are quite costly and not necessarily ready to do in any sort of practical application without some effort and some dollars. Atomic absorption spectroscopy, inductively coupled plasma AES, neutron activation analysis, some techniques that are pretty lab intensive and not necessarily something that's in folks' repertoire. The portable handheld XRF is often used in a scrapyard to quickly characterize metals for recycling purposes. It's used often in geology and archaeology, as well as some geotechnical applications. This work, I kind of read some work by Amy Serrato and her team at Oklahoma University, and they actually used a handheld XRF to essentially do quality control of lime and fly ash stabilized soils. And they used that handheld XRF to essentially see if they could use it to confirm how much stabilizer was put in the granular bases that were being put in place. And so a lot of this work, they were very successful in showing that you can use the handheld XRF with simple sampling techniques to essentially be a quality control tool or quality assurance, depending on who's actually doing the testing, for silicate and calcareous granular materials. So we tried to extend it into RCA. Now, obviously, we have some different challenges. Soils are smaller particle size. RCA is by nature a composite material. So we had some things to overcome. But our goal was essentially to develop a sampling and testing method to support use of our handheld XRF device to, number one, predict mortar content, and number two, predict chemical composition. So we had 2 goals. Our particular handheld device is shown there. The scrapyard use, he's sort of pointing and shooting. Obviously, the downside of that is essentially it's a little bit safer to have it on the benchtop mode because you can essentially cover the beam and your user is isolated from the beam. It's a little bit safer application than the point and shoot. So we use the benchtop approach. We had a number of different RCA samples for this study. We got a bunch from Nebraska because that's where Dr. Hu and his team were. We also had some from North Carolina. We also sourced some from Nevada, Iowa, and Texas. We have a beautiful subset of pictures there, and you can tell they're a very diverse subset of aggregates there. Some were from highway sources, right, which offer the advantage of sort of being a single mix that you kind of trust that met agency standards, probably higher quality. We got some crushed airfield pavement, also high quality RCA, but we also picked up some stuff from some C&D recycling centers. And they run the challenge of sort of being a hodgepodge and you're never quite sure where it came from, what standards that original source concrete met. So we kind of had an across the board different type of RCA quality in terms of sort of original compressive strength, original use, number of years of service life, as well as the clearly coming from across the US, we had a number of different kinds of aggregates contained in there and cement sources. This is what we were working with. For our work, we started, just because shipping aggregates is costly, we started with the North Carolina aggregates to essentially develop our protocol, and then we expanded to sort of validate our technique with the other sources once we got moving. So that being said, a little bit about the physical characteristics of what we looked at. A lot of this work was performed at UNL and was part of this morning's presentation by Dr. Hu. But essentially, we took a look at our specific gravities, our absorptions. The University of Nebraska team has developed some more standardized and efficient protocol for crushing value and residual mortar content that I would love to direct you to. These tests are not new, but one of the problems is in the literature, these characterization tests, although useful, folks have not either standardized them or they're getting sort of, they're explaining how they did it, but leaving parts out and not coming up with a complete protocol that's sort of optimized for getting you results with confidence. And I direct you to the final report. We ended up with a range of specific gravities, and that specific gravity, the lower specific gravities are probably your ones with the higher mortar content, and essentially maybe the lower quality, higher void system in there. Our higher quality aggregates from the airfield pavements have higher specific gravities. And in terms of residual mortar content, you can see we had a range of numbers there ranging from, it looks like 33% up to 72%, with the Nebraska aggregates being notably high just due to the fact that their DOT gradations are a little bit sandy compared to the rest of the US. So we had a range of different aggregates here. These values are actually for the number 60. It's the average for a bunch of particle sizes within the number 67. We actually ran these tests for fractionated pieces, which is published in the report. But to develop a protocol to use the XRF to characterize these, we kind of had a flow chart here. Essentially, we didn't know if our testing was any good unless we had reference values, right? And so down at the bottom of my little flow chart method here, we started by doing thermal shock method, and that was the procedure developed by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to give us our reference residual mortar content. And then we also used a geochemical analysis method that's common in the mining and other mineral industries called whole rock analysis. And whole rock analysis, essentially, I gotta look at my notes here. Whole rock analysis includes all sorts of approaches. It uses ICP, it uses mass spectroscopy, it uses, it's a series of tests that essentially is a chemical characterization of the rock, but they pulverize it. And so essentially we sent samples to a lab for that full geochemical analysis, and that served as our reference. And then to see if we could get those values or predict them using our handheld XRF measurements, we considered a number of different factors. We ended up working with 3 different size fractions, and I'll explain a little bit about that once I move forward here on the slides. But we basically collected data with our handheld XRF, and we developed models to try to see if we could accurately predict what we were getting through the more expensive, more intensive lab testing that's usually out of reach for folks who really want to use recycled aggregate. And so what we did, just a little bit on this thermal shock method and a plug for Dr. Hu's work at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Obviously, that mortar content is going to drive water demand if you're trying to use it in new concrete. That also tends to be the part that abrades off if you're using RCA and unbound uses. And so it's always of interest to see what the residual mortar content is on RCA. And so this particular test method, if you expose wet concrete to high temperature, it eventually experiences dehydration and leads to decrease in strength, and eventually you just sort of, as shown in those 2 pictures below, you kind of break off all the mortar and you're left with the base aggregates, and you can just basically do a weight change to see what your residual mortar content is. The problem was there's people who've done this in the past but haven't necessarily standardized or optimized the procedure for either temperature, time, or other parameters. So this particular method was optimized by University of Nebraska-Lincoln and used as our reference for our work with the XRF. We assumed this was going to be our target values. The whole rock analysis that we did sent to a lab out west that works predominantly with geochemical stuff from the mining industries and such. These values are essentially percent weight or parts per million, and you can see we sent our North Carolina aggregates. These are sort of our target values for what we'd see there. And obviously you can tell our aggregates in North Carolina, typically granitic gneiss from Raleigh west and to the east. We had one sample that was actually a marine limestone, a little higher in the calcium there, NCCT2. So these results kind of fed right into what we thought we were going to get. Our XRF test method, we leaned a lot on Dr. Serrato's work at Oklahoma. We had to consider the sample type and preparation. We really had to think about that sample thickness. We knew that the XRF was not going to be able to directly compute composition because the beam only hits and goes in a shallow little bit, right? So the chemical composition from the chemistry lab, they pulverize it and actually physically test the full sample. The XRF only bounces off the surface and goes to a certain depth. I think for some elements it's pretty shallow, hundredths to thousandths of an inch. And I think our deepest element, the penetration depth, was 0.16 of an inch. So we knew we're not going to directly measure composition, but can we predict it? And so we were working with sample thicknesses. We were working with the duration of scan. We essentially used what Dr. Serrato had learned from her work with soils. And we also developed this, we used their scanning technique. What we did was we put our different size fractions of recycled aggregates in those little cups, made sure it was about a ½ inch deep since the beam could penetrate up to 0.16 of an inch. And then we essentially put our little cup on top of the nose of our XRF in the benchtop mode, which covers nicely with a little safety unit as well. We would essentially run 3 different measurements in each quadrant and average 12 samples to essentially get our results. And that's a lot of data, but essentially what we did was we measured for each of our 4 different North Carolina aggregates. We measured the number 4, the number 12, the number 50, came up with average element concentrations and weight percent as measured by the XRF through those 12 measurements. And this was sort of the data set we worked with. Our first thing we thought about was, let's see if any of this is statistically significant. And so we ran ANOVA to basically see if it was statistically difference between particle sizes and also the differences statistically significant across all 4 of our types. What you see highlighted in green is our p-values showing what was statistically significant. And for the most part, particle size mattered, source mattered, and we proved to ourselves this thing was measuring statistically significant differences between those samples. From there, we started looking at, okay, we know that this XRF is not going to necessarily be able to directly give us our composition, but how close is it? And so essentially, we looked at a coefficient of variation, root mean standard deviation, and the coefficient of variation of the root mean standard deviation. Some fun statistics for folks that love statistics. Here's where my students just like, don't even go there. But essentially, this is comparing, all right, what is the value that the XRF gives versus the whole rock analysis? And you want that to be close to the unity line. What we found was for our trace elements, tended to be pretty close. Even though that XRF was only shooting the surface, the values were fairly close. We had our MSDs closer to below 1. For some of our more prevalent materials, aluminum, silica, calcium, it was really influenced by the fact that the whole rock analysis pulverized the entire sample. You have so much volume of that calcium and silica coming in from the bulk aggregate in there. They weren't close. But at least we knew where we stood with some of those direct readings and understood the data we were getting. So what we did was we essentially then, for a prediction of our mortar content, we did stepwise regression, we did backwards and forwards removal approaches, and essentially for each particle size, how do we get the best prediction for mortar content? And we used the values from thermal shock method from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and see if our which variables from our XRF could be used to create a prediction equation. And as you can tell, our R-squared values were close to 1. For each of those sizes, it tended to be some different variables, whether it was vanadium, phosphorus, lead, chromium. We were pretty darn close. And you can see our percent differences for each of the size fraction, the measured versus predicted, using those different equations. And so we demonstrated to ourselves that for each of those sizes, you could use certain elements coming out of that XRF gun to predict your residual mortar content. Now our initial hunch was we'd see some of the more common elements in the prediction equations. We thought we'd see calcium, we thought we'd see silica, we thought we'd see aluminum. And little did we know, the best predictors are some of your more not so nice heavy metals, your RCA, things that aren't so friendly to you, some of that stuff. But they're present in the paste. So this made sense then, right? Those metals are going to be coming in with your fly ash. They might be present in some of the cement. And essentially that XRF is bouncing into the surface and catching that mortar content, and they make great predictors. We then actually expanded our models. We added the other 5 additional recycled aggregates from Texas, Nebraska, and Iowa. We took, of those extra aggregates, we put some of them in to train our models, and we kept 2 out to basically assess the models. And once we did our improved models, we came up with essentially a second equation that worked for our set. Really high R-squared value and pretty close for both a Texas aggregate and a Nebraska aggregate on that mortar content. So we kind of showed ourselves that we could do this. In terms of the chemical composition, a little bit harder because of the fact that we had interground bulk samples and we're trying to use a surface measurement to correlate. So we just plotted the heck out of it. And what I'm showing on the right is essentially our manganese weight versus what they measured in the lab versus what we're getting from the XRF for our 3 fraction sizes. And once we did this for all of our elements across all of our different measurements, we essentially took a look at the R-squared values and saw what might make sense. What you see is green R-squared values meant a pretty good model, fairly predictable. Yellow R-squared values, not so great of a model. And the red ones weren't even close, kind of your traditional shotgun plot approach. And so what we found is some elements were more predictable than others. Silica, calcium, potassium, which is important for things like ASR. Things with the green predicted well. The approach shows promise, but essentially since we only had a limited number of reference samples, so this is a couple $100 to get each of these whole rock samples done, our takeaway from this is that if you were to do this in practice, you probably want to build yourself a reference set that matches sort of your local sources and pick some samples that represent what you're seeing in terms of your RCA coming in, get those reference values, and we'd probably see the predictability go up if you had a broader set of reference values. And so after that, we sort of took our procedure and we wrote up a recommended procedure so that someone else could replicate our work. We kind of see it as if you're commonly seeing RCA coming into your jobs. I see Eric there from Colorado. I need to talk to you. You got lots of RCA coming in. Creating a reference database and then following this approach, you'd create your own prediction equations based on what you're seeing. We had aggregates from all over the US and had some fairly good predictive models, but we're thinking if someone actually had lots of RCA from Colorado coming in, you could pick and choose your reference set fairly well. And you could also build your own calibration set. We were using the Mudrock calibration file that came with our XRF. But you can customize that, and we could probably make even stronger predictions. But we do, in our draft paper, which is in an ACI Materials Journal and in review, we have this procedure down so that folks could give it a try and develop their models. So in conclusion, this could serve as a basis for somebody to develop their own database and predictive models. We need some additional study for more RCAs. Users can take this approach and work with it, develop their own reference set, their own predictive models that might work better. And in lieu of the manufacturer provided file, maybe make your own reference file for your device. Models for both the number 4 and number 12 size seem to give us good prediction for the major and trace element composition, but we kind of saw that essentially the residual mortar content was best predicted by number 4 So we're thinking that for RCA, there'd be advantage in just using what's retained on the number 4 sieve, which offers the advantages of a single size, and then also the number 4 should be present in both your fine and coarse aggregate. So you'd actually be able to do composition of both fine RCA and coarse RCA, given that number 4 size as part of your use. One of the downsides, we did see that the heavy metals were the strongest predictors of residual mortar content, and although they're there in very small concentrations, there's a lot that goes on that nobody's really drinking the water coming off of RCA. It may draw negative attention to this material that we really want to use in a recycling application, which was a little bit disappointing, but could be overcome. And in closing, the complex composition of RCA makes it a little bit more challenging to use, but hopefully the work that we did as part of this committee-sponsored project, not only this approach with the Handheld XRF, but the other approaches that were focused on by University of Nebraska, give some folks some tools to more rapidly characterize their RCA, get confidence, and use it in bound and unbound applications. If you're interested, this paper is currently, I've got the reviewers' comments back. I need to address them and get it back in so it can eventually get published. But the final report is available at the ACI Foundation's website. It's at the bottom there. And 2 papers based on some of the other work are currently published in the Journal of Cleaner Production and will be coming out in the Materials Journal soon. So thank you very much.